Hi 8th graders, and welcome to a video segment on Impressionistic Writing. And we've been talking rather briefly over the last couple of weeks about different styles of writing. So I want you to have in your notebook a section that is just maybe listed as styles. You could put styles of writing. And over the course of this year, we're going to be learning more of those styles of writing that you've probably heard a little bit about, but not a lot. But you're in 8th grade now, so it's time to learn some of these different methods that create good writing. We talked a little bit with Rikki Tikki Tavi about some of the symbolism that shows up in there. So I want to talk about that just briefly, because I did have a few of you ask a little bit more about what symbolism is. As the year goes on and we get closer to working on Dickens' A Christmas Carol, we will be talking quite a bit about symbolism. But with symbolism, if you think about the root of the word symbol, you're looking for symbols in the literature. What might the author be using, either through characters or setting, to create some symbolism? So, for example, in the Rikki Tikki Tavi story, there is evil present, and the evil is present in the Cobra family, and we see them kind of striking at all sides. They want to kill the human family, they want to kill Rikki, and they have no mercy. So we would see them as evil in the story. And so if I said to you, compare and contrast the evil in Rikki Tikki Tavi with evil in today's culture, you would look for, those who are trying to destroy. And the Cobras were definitely trying to destroy. In the same theme of things, Rikki represents good. He represents a hero. He represents trying to change something really impossible. And he takes on this big thing. And when we talk about the comparisons and contrasts between Rikki and Frederick Douglass, there are comparisons between them, because Frederick Douglass tries to take on something really big. He's a hero to his people and even to those outside of his culture. And so that's what I mean by symbolism. So make sure you jot a few notes about symbolism, and we will return to that. But today we are going to be focusing on impressionistic writing. And so when we are in between assignments, when we're working on a long assignment, expect a few more of these kinds of segments where you're learning about a certain type of writing. And you will have a chance to actually use some of this impressionistic writing in a short story that we're going to be doing. So I wanted to introduce symbolism to you, and I want to introduce impressionistic writing. And I'm going to give you some samples. I don't believe that you guys read Red Badge of Courage anymore, but there are some samples of impressionistic writing in there, and I will read some of those to you in a little bit. So let's start with what impressionistic writing is. Impressionism is a depiction in literature of a scene, emotion, or character by details intended to achieve a vividness or effectiveness, more by evoking subjective and sensory impressions than by creating an objective reality. So one of the things in impressionistic art is that it's not often completely a straight-on, clear image. A lot of times the edges or parts of the scene will be a little blurred or will blend in to another piece of the picture. And so impressionistic literature often uses some of those same kinds of techniques. There will be things painted for you in words. Remember last year, if you were with me, we did descriptive assignments, and we talked about painting words or painting pictures with your words. So we want to, when it talks about, it wants to, a depiction in literature of a scene or emotion or a character by details that are intended to achieve vividness or effectiveness by impressions. And I'm going to read some, and I think you'll understand in a little bit. But here's an example of an impressionistic art piece, and they do have these all throughout this video. So, or not this video, this PowerPoint. Some of the authors, one of them I've already mentioned, Crane. Stephen Crane wrote The Red Badge of Courage. He uses impressionistic symbols and impressionistic language. It's ambiguous. That means that it's not often clear. It's not, there are images being printed on your brain, but they might not be the same as for someone else. And so that's what the impressionistic authors wanted to communicate or wanted to do. It depends on your background. And when I read some of these samples in a minute, what one of you may see, and perhaps if I told you to draw it, what one of you may draw may be very different than someone else. So it places the responsibility on the reader to form his or her own conclusions about the events within the novel, rather than relying on the narrator. So it creates pictures in your mind that may be solely unique to you. The author will often describe the action through the eyes of a character while the events are occurring, rather than providing details after the fact. So the character in the midst of the story is communicating something, and you're looking through their eyes. And I want to go ahead and do an example here, and I've chosen Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage. There are a couple of examples that I'm going to read. And as I read this, you're going to actually see him using his words to paint pictures. So let me read just a couple of paragraphs, and then I will comment on it. He became aware that the furnace roar of the battle was growing louder. Great brown clouds had floated to the still heights of the air before him. The noise, too, was approaching. The woods filtered men, and the fields became dotted. As he rounded a hill, he perceived that the roadway was now a crying mass of wagons, teams, and men. From the heaving tangle issued exhortations, commands, imprecations. Fear was sweeping it all along. The cracking whips bit, and the horses plunged and tugged. The white-topped wagons strained and stumbled in their exertions like fat sheep. The youth felt comforted in a measure by this sight. They were retreating. Perhaps then he was not so bad after all. He seated himself and watched the terror-stricken wagons. They fled like soft, ungainly animals. All the roarers and lashers served to help him to magnify the dangers and horrors of the engagement, that he might try to prove to himself that the thing with which men could charge him was in truth a symmetrical act. There was no amount of pleasure to him in watching the wild march of this vindication. So our main character has retreated from the fighting, and he's feeling some guilt. But as he becomes aware of his surroundings, he sees that all of the armies are retreating. And so he gives us this picture. And he doesn't just say the army is retreating. Instead, he becomes aware of a furnace roar of the battle. And if you think about a furnace roaring on, especially in an old building, and sometimes the steam that will come out of it, he talks about great brown clouds floating to still heights of air before him. He's beginning to hear that furnace roar. He's beginning to see the clouds of smoke, or dust in this case, as the armies move away from the fighting. He talks about the roadway being a crying mass of wagons, teams, and men. And if you think of a crying mass of people, it would be fairly hysterical. If there were a whole bunch of us, thousands of people crying, it would be a hysterical situation, depressing. Well, he's using that now to tell us about the wagons and teams. He also talks about cracking whips and the horses plunging and tugging, white-topped wagons that are strained and stumbling. It's not a peaceful marching away. Instead, it is a terror-stricken, panicked marching away. So that's one example from the Red Badge of Courage that Stephen Crane uses. Let's move on. So the author is concerned with an emotional landscape of the setting. And I think in what we just read, we do perceive that emotion. There's fear, there's panic going on. The author is interested in the way the landscape evokes certain emotional responses. And so that is what happens here with what Stephen Crane is doing. He's causing an emotional response from us. We become panicked as we read his words. Sometimes especially in the art, so here's an example of impressionistic art, sometimes it is difficult to see a clear picture. So, we would look at this art sample and none of us we would all probably say it's pretty, but it doesn't really give us a clear picture of anything. And the same can be true in some of the writing. Now, not necessarily in what I just read you. That's fairly clear in what he's trying to communicate. But sometimes an author will use words that really cause the reader to have to make some assumptions. Here are a couple of impressionistic paintings of portraits. And in the same way, and again, these aren't clear. We see awkward backgrounds. They give the reader, in writing, it gives the reader information to make them focus on how and why things happen, but we're not necessarily focusing on the orderly piece. And so if you look at these paintings, they're not necessarily orderly paintings. So some of the authors of an impressionistic era, I have mentioned Stephen Crane. Joseph Conrad was an impressionistic author. He wrote Heart of Darkness. You may read that a little bit later in high school, I'm not sure. One of his quotes, "Perhaps life is just that, a dream and a fear." Henry James wrote The Portrait of a Lady. I've always been interested in people, but I've never liked them. It's one of his quotes. And Ulysses by James Joyce, "Mistakes are the portals of discovery." These are just some examples of authors of that time period. So let me do some samples from some of these guys. And I want you to look for those images that they're trying to portray. I want you to think about the words they're using and what images you're getting in your mind. So let's read this quote together. "I saw a face amongst the leaves on the level with my own, looking at me very fierce and steady. And then suddenly, as though a veil had been removed from my eyes, I made out deep in the tangled gloom, naked breasts, arms, legs, glaring eyes. The bush was swarming with human limbs in movement, glistening of bronze color. The twigs shook, swayed, and rustled. The arrows flew out of them, and then the shutter came too." Now, if we had a picture of what he was writing about here, I would describe it as looking into a forest. And I've seen some artists who've actually created a picture from this. He's looking at a forest or an image, and we see some of that pop out. I see a face among the leaves on the level with my own. So that indicates that there's nature around. Looking at me very fierce and steady. How many of you have ever, especially in darkness, or looking at clouds, seeing images. It's kind of what's going on here. He's looking into a forest. He sees images. He says, and then suddenly, as though a veil had been removed from my eyes, I make out, deep in the tangled gloom, naked breasts, arms, legs, glaring eyes. He's seeing bushes and tree limbs that are moving in the wind, and he sees colors. Here at the bottom of the narrative, the twigs shook and swayed and rustled. The arrows flew out of them, and then the shudder came too. So we see him doing a couple of things. First of all, we see that impressionistic style, but we also see a bit of personification going on, where he's bringing the nature to life and giving it arms and legs and eyes. Part of this is to think through, what does the narrator, and again, it's somebody narrating the story. We notice that he pays attention to color. He pays attention to movement. There's something going on that's probably evil. You haven't read the whole story, but that might indicate that he's under attack. And we see him experiencing this by what he's looking at in nature, and things are starting to happen to him. So as you write your short stories, and this is going to be a little bit down the road, I don't want you to just say, I was being attacked, or I was experiencing a bad situation, by someone that was coming after me, or they were chasing me. Consider using some impressionistic style where you perhaps are hovering in the corner of a dark house and you see shadows, or you see a cabinet that seems to move in the darkness, and it seems to move towards you, and you're uncertain of why the cabinet doors are opening and why it would be coming towards you. That is a different way to tell me that somebody is chasing you or somebody is coming after you than you just telling me that. So think about the story you can tell through images, through personification, through impressionism, through symbolism. Consider in your story, who is the evil? Who is the symbol of evil? Who is the symbol of good? So it's important to think through some of these things and to practice a little bit with them before you actually write with them. Now, here is a painting that has been done of what Conrad may have been talking about, Joseph Conrad may have been talking about, and it tells you to write exactly what you think. You don't necessarily have to do that. But especially if this were darker and you were looking into this forest, you would probably see this image here. Is it a man? Is it another trunk? Is it a man hiding? Is this a woman? Or is he hiding behind something? Look at all the brush and look around and see if you can see other things, or look to see if you see eyes anywhere in there. So that's what Impressionism wants to do. It wants us to make us use our imagination, probably a lot more than we normally would. All right, before I close this segment, let me read one more by Stephen Crane in The Red Badge of Courage. And again, I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs. The column that had butted stoutly at the obstacles in the roadway was barely out of the youth's sight before he saw dark waves of men come sweeping out of the woods and down through the fields. He knew at once that the steel fibers had been washed from their hearts. They were bursting from their coats and their equipments as from entanglements. They charged down upon him like terrified buffaloes. Behind them blue smoke curled and clouded above the treetops, and through the thickets he could sometimes see a distant pink glare. The voices of the cannon were clamoring in interminable chorus. The youth was horror-stricken. He stared in agony and amazement. He forgot that he was engaged in combating the universe. He threw aside his mental pamphlets on the philosophy of the retreated and rules for the guidance of the damned. The fright was lost. The dragons were coming with invincible strides. The army, helpless in the matted thickets and blinded by the overhanging night, was going to be swallowed. War, the red animal, war, the blood-swollen god, would have bloated Phil. So here's another example where there's so much imagery that causes impressions in your mind, and that's where we get that word impressionistic. Seeing a column that's butted stoutly at the obstacles in the roadway, bursting from their coats and their equipments. They were charging like terrified buffalo. You can also use some simile in here. We see blue smoke curling above the treetops. I love this one. The voices of the cannon were clamoring in interminable chorus. Think about cannons in a chorus, and they must have been going off one after the other. So think about some of these examples that I've provided for you. I will actually put Stephen Crane's examples from the Red Badge of Courage. I will take a picture of those and put them up on Sycamore so that you can look at them, or just so that you can have them there for examples. But hopefully this helps you understand a little bit about what impressionistic writing is, and we will be trying to do some of these techniques within some assignments that we'll be doing in the very near future. So take the notes that you've taken from this, keep them in your notebook, and we will refer to them later.